Thank you for taking the time to watch this episode of Life Support. If you enjoy the content, we would ask that you like it, hit subscribe, and share it with your friends. Hey, it's so good to have you on Life Support. This show is all about stories and helping us all understand and be reminded that Jesus is about redemption. He changes lives, and I'm so glad you're here, and I hope you'll be encouraged by what you hear today. My guest is George Lang, the Executive Director of Freedom Works. And George, I'm so glad to have you here. Thanks for dropping by.
Well, thank you for having me.
Freedom Works, tell me about that. What is Freedom Works all about?
So Freedom Works is a Christ-centered reentry and aftercare model. We focus currently. There's a high demand for men that are in recovery coming out of incarceration, and there always has been, but there's so much that they're coming out to now, and the drugs have changed so much, so we've expanded. We offer treatment services at Freedom Works now. We've got 7 different reentry models. One is Christ-centered, that when they sign up for this, they know that they want to be discipled in Christ, follower of Christ. The others are faith-based but not faith-forced. And we are dealing with a population of men coming out of incarceration that have never experienced what it's like to be in a healthy community. And so we have 150 people at our Emerson campus, and everything, all the aspects of programming is Christ is in the center of all of it. It's not forced, though.
That's cool. So obviously your story comes into play because you know about this and you're working at Freedom Works. And tell me a little bit about what led you to this point in your life.
So this is...
That's a hard question.
Yeah, let's go back to kindergarten.
Yeah, right, yeah.
But, so, I did, should I start with kind of
Sure.
where I grew up?
Yeah.
In St. Paul, on the west side of St. Paul. Predominantly Hispanic neighborhood. Grew up with, that culture, that flavor of my neighborhood was well set in me. But we lived right next to the projects, the Dundee projects, and had maybe 100 or so families and maybe 2 men, So there was an absence of men. Also, on the outside of where we grew up, across the street, there was just a lot of dysfunction in homes, a lot of alcoholism, drugs would come into play. But my family broke up. I'm thinking it was about 8. I was about 8 or 9, and so by the time I was 10, I was just pretty much on my own. I had a mother, had a father. They're both missing, and had older siblings that were all hurting as well. And so that's the start of my journey of at 10 years old of getting into alcohol, then it's drugs, then it's embedded in crime by the time I'm 12, and I just lived that life until I surrendered my life to Christ, which would be when I was 35 years old. So
12 years old.
12 years old. Yeah.
It's a lot of parents would think, well, my child couldn't possibly be involved with those things at 12.
Yeah. I look at, I've had, or I do have 4 children, and
Yeah.
I've looked at my boys as they're all adults now, but, I had my first apartment when I was 14.
Wow.
And so when I look at them, I'm like, how could, they barely can even make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, let alone that. But
I know the feeling.
I guess growing up in survival, you
Yeah.
get put into a bad spot. And I often say that I learned life on my own terms.
Yeah.
With a bunch of dysfunctional people around me.
You weren't playing video games. You were living it out.
Yeah.
Out there on the street, huh?
I was.
So you mentioned the absence of men. Tell me what effect or consequences came from that.
Well, if I could just state that this is all normal to me.
Yeah.
At this time, right? Mm-hmm. So even though I had a father, my father wasn't there. It's just everything's normal. It's everything around me, but there is no positive role models in our life. So when I say that we figured out life on our own terms, I should add in the guys that I grew up with, and they also didn't have positive male influences. So we had no direction as a kid. What we had survival and we had each other, and so we had to figure out what life was like. So the first time that I had any positive male influences in my life was in prison fellowship program. That's really the first time.
Wow.
And now you start to realize maybe the way I live my life isn't normal. Right?
Yeah, there's another way.
There's another way.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
There's nobody there to challenge or guide you in life. Yeah.
Yeah, we've had guests here that have talked about life on the streets, and that this issue comes up a lot. Basically, where are the men, and the effect of that fatherlessness or the absence of men in a neighborhood is such a huge thing. And I don't know if culture or society really understands that.
Well, I hear the statistics quoted all the time that 80% of those that are incarcerated today, men, well, their children will be doing time as well. So we know what the effects are. There's a lot of great organizations that are focused on turning that around, but that's a pretty big ocean liner to turn around.
Yeah, it really is. And it really comes down to individuals like you and me that try to model it for our children, and then they model it for their children, right? And
Yeah.
it's not always easy, and we're all fallen people, but we can certainly rely on Christ and do the best we can. So you mentioned you finally found Christ when you were in your 30s.
It was. So that was my I've been in prison 5 times, but that's my 3rd prison sentence. I had a couple violations. I wasn't cooperative, so to speak.
Yeah.
But what sent me to prison on this time was I've always been an entrepreneur ever since I was a kid. I wouldn't know what that word is when I was a kid, but
Yeah.
I've always been self-reliant. Just if I was going to get it, I had to get it myself, and that turns into just maybe an opportunist person. I can see areas of I like business, so I had bought a bar and turned it into a nightclub in St. Paul, and then of course I sold cocaine for the majority of my youth and my adult hood up to this point. And so I incorporated, of course I'm going to incorporate the club, the bar scene with the cocaine, and life just became really messy real quick, and for everything from shootings in my bar, gang violence. My brother got shot in the head 3 times. 3 other people got shot, and this was kind of the day of reckoning, so to speak, when it all started to crumble. And so I ended up going to prison. I was pulled over on suspicion of a shooting of a guy that I grew up with, which I didn't shoot at him. They were trying to, I'll say, pin this case on me. But when they found I had a gun in my car, had nothing to do with the shooting. Well, that was good enough to get a felon in possession of a firearm. So I went to prison for 5 years, and I've been through a lot of stuff in my life, but this was a breaking point. I was married, had 4 children, had a home, had a business, I had a lot of things going right too, and it just all started to fall apart, one thing after another. And my wife was leaving me for my cousin, and it was in public display because I still owned the bar. I'm just locked up. Well, everybody knows my wife's having an affair. That's one thing. But when she said she was leaving, she was taking everything I owned with her. Now, it's not so much the material things. It's more of what I would come, because I'm in a relationship with Christ. These were gods that weren't identified in my life. So I was a legend in my own mind, the Scarface of type.
Yep.
I wouldn't say wealth as, most people would identify, but, I had what I wanted, right? I had my status. And it's just it was all destroyed. It just was all gone. And I found myself in Faribault Prison, and it was July 4th, And I found out this about my wife July 5th. Ended up, I think it was July 5th, that ended up in an altercation with another guy. Ended up on July 6th, the squad, be it the correctional officers, came to my room, which I thought it was because I assaulted this person. It wasn't. It was because they were doing a shakedown on me because I was running what we call stores in prison, selling 2 for $1. Well, of course, I'm industrious. Of course, that's what I'm going to do. Mm-hmm. So they sent me to the hole, and the next day, on July 7th, I got a letter in the mail, which I never get. Nobody writes me. The entourage I had, they're not around me no more. All the guys I grew up with, they're not there. And I get this letter from this lady, and I open up the letter, and the first paragraph said that because of what you did, my husband is now in an affair with your wife, and your kids are calling him dad, and he's driving your car, wearing your gold. Wow. You know, the gods, right?
Yeah.
And now this was on July 7th, and I just, this is a 4-page letter I've never read. I just read that paragraph. To this day, I still have the letter. I just haven't read it. Mm-hmm. But I fell to my knees, and I asked God to come into my life, and I didn't know who God was. And I woke up, there's no clocks on the wall in segregation, but I woke up, and I didn't know the scriptures. I didn't know any scripture. I didn't grow up in church. I will now identify a scripture of, I had a peace that surpasses all understanding. And I couldn't understand what just happened to me. As I sat on this, I got off the floor in segregation, and there was a guy that came by just as soon as I woke up and said, "Hey, you want something to read?" And I said, "Yeah." And he throws in a Bible. I've never read a Bible before. And I opened it up, just, in the midpoint. And it said, "Blessed is the man who does not counsel in the wicked." Mm-hmm. And back on the floor crying again. Mm-hmm. And because it was almost like a flash of my last 35 years of my life of being around nothing but people that, I don't mean to down people in my life, they're, but mm-hmm. they're about as wicked as you can get.
Yeah.
They don't know it. They just don't know it.
Yeah.
This is normal for them too. And I just cried, and I fell out again, and I woke back up, and then this is strange, but a guy comes by again. "Hey, you want another book?" It was a different person. And he throws in this little book called Praise Works by a guy out of World War II or something that had found Christ. And his foundation was built on praising God, and just, it's all new, right?
Yeah.
So I get out of segregation. I talk to the chaplain. Long story short, I get sent down to prison fellowship, which is called IFI at the time. Can't remember what IFI stands for now, but now it's called Prison Fellowship Academy. And I walk into, I was transported here, right? I was transported from one prison to another. And I walk into what they call Community of the Chapel, and there's about 100 guys, and there's about 20 of them with their hands in the air, crying out to God. And I said, "What the hell did I sign up for here? What's this goofy stuff?"
Right.
That's where it starts for me.
Wow.
And then maybe 9 months later, I asked Christ to come in my life. I don't know if I answered your question.
No, you did. That's, it's amazing to me that you didn't know anything.
Nothing.
But God intervened, in a miraculous way.
He really did.
I think sometimes we have this view of, we have to teach people these certain things in order to get them ready for God to, to change them or interact with their life. We didn't know a thing.
I didn't. Well, can I back up? When I was in St. Cloud prison before I went to Faribault, the guys I grew up with, a lot of them were in prison, mm-hmm. and we would meet down at this chapel, and there's about 30 guys in a circle. That's how we communicate when they're in different blocks. We just go to a religious service. But I didn't grow up in the church at all. I just want to identify that. And at some point, the chaplain was talking to this guy as this guy was crying about losing his kids. And he was telling him, "Well, this is why Jesus died for you." And I'm listening to this just nonsense. It's just not.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty outspoken. So I speak up in the middle of the circle and said, what the hell are you telling this guy? The guy just lost his kids, and you're telling him that somebody died for him 2,000 years ago? I can't even get a family member to send me in a money order.
Yeah, right.
It's just gibberish.
Like it didn't even connect for you at all.
And so he called squad on me, so I was pretty upset about it. So squad came and got me, brought me back to my cell. They didn't put me in SAG or nothing. Then I got a kite internal messaging from the chaplain that said, don't come back until you get it figured out. That's a quote.
Wow.
And I remember looking at it going, well, I thought church was supposed to help you figure it out or whatever, but I wasn't down there for that. And then I'll fast forward back into now I'm in prison fellowship in the midst of the assembly of those that are on this journey. Everybody's on a different spot, right? But and I'm like, man, what the heck am I doing here?
Yeah.
So that's where it starts.
Wow. It's pretty neat. I've had a chance to speak at a couple Teen Challenge services, if you want to call them that. But it's quite an experience because you have people there who are unafraid to show their emotion. They know what they've been forgiven for. They know who they are. They know what God is doing in their life. They're grateful. And it's like being a part of the early church to watch them and it's kind of like what you were experiencing. It's like this, it's all brand new. It's kind of like this new life, refreshing, like, wow, there's hope now for me kind of stuff. When did you start really latching on to what had really happened?
So it's every day I'm questioning why I'm here, right? At some point, I asked Christ to come in my life. I really I don't know if it was 6 months later, had a phenomenal biblical counselor that was teaching us the word. There was the things that were happening are unexplainable. The conversations I'm in and how that's lining up with the word is just alive, coming out. There was men that I'm incarcerated with that I've known from the street or in prison, from my many times in prison, that were straight riders, convicts, if you will, that badge of honor, if I'll call it that there's something different about them. And then I start to, what is it about, what has he got that, there's something different, right? So I start drawn to certain people. I would say that people started to mentor me in a way that I wouldn't know what that meant at the time.
Right.
They're sharing their faith. I'm starting to gain hope. Now I've surrendered my life to Christ. Now I'm arguing with everybody, and so all that dynamic is going down, and I joined a choir. I don't even know how all this happens. You know what I mean? Like
you go from being on the floor in the hole is what you call it, right? And now you're in a choir.
Yeah, or even if I back up, going from the legend in my own mind.
Yeah, right.
I grew up in crime. This isn't how we get down.
You didn't have to wear robes, did you? Choir robes?
No.
Okay, that might have been a bridge too far.
I don't know. I don't know. There was some talk about getting them. We were pretty excited that time instead of wearing the blues. But then we got staff. So it really started with the guys that I did time with and their influence over me. And there was one particular one, if I could just give a shout, he's passed away. His name was Aaron Burks, who was our worship leader. And Aaron was professed. He was a openly gay guy in prison. And I knew him from back in the 90s, and there was no way I'm going to be talking to this guy.
Yeah.
And then I moved cells, and he put me across the cell from him. And there was something about him, again, that people that I respected that were straight convict types that were going to him and counseling with him. And then when I finally just kind of got through that mindset that, stay away from him because of his past.
Yes.
man, he was such a powerful influence over me, powerful influence. So I would say my first mentors were guys I did time with. And then we had an amazing staff. Randy Washington was my biblical counselor, and God used him every day to speak. We had programming happening in the AM and in the PM. We're just being just induced, right?
Yeah.
We're just in the middle of God's, where how this is happening, and but now I'm about to get out of prison. And my former life is in St. Paul. All my gods are in St. Paul. Everything I know, relationships are in St. Paul. My kids, my ex-wife, and, my bar, and that was a pretty big God to let go of, right?
Yeah.
And I'm getting out. I'm going back, and I'm taking back what is mine.
That's a perfect place to stop,
Okay.
because that's going to lead us into the next time we have you.
Okay.
And it's like a TV show where you're just like, I'm about to get out. You got to watch next time. Same bat time, same bat channel. But tell me about Freedom Works before we go, because you're heavily involved with that. Tell me what you do there.
So Freedom Works, what does tip into, I got out, went to Freedom Works, ran from my old life, and Fred Peterson, our founder, had a vision while serving in prison fellowship that freedom does work. Us guys were getting out of prison and coming back on violations because they had no support. They didn't have what we had on the inside, prison fellowship. So he had a vision. God gave him a vision for prison fellowship, a community, I should say, on the outside. So he bought a property with some other people from his church, which was Wyzetta Free at the time, and they all rallied together, created the safe, sober environment that we could have a continuation of our faith. And so I came out to Freedom Works, and that was in 2006. But then I started serving because I had to stay busy. I was volunteering.
Yeah.
Because I had to stay busy. Somewhere in there, it changed to serving. Then I became a part-time staff. I wasn't looking for it. It just wasn't. They offered me a full-time position. I thought, my God, I'm still thinking of killing people over that did me wrong, you know?
Right.
And then God just got a hold of me in a deeper way. And I would say in 2009, he called me. Even though I was working there, I wasn't called. I didn't feel I was called. I was just helping out, right? And but no, he hit me with Isaiah 42:22, and these are my people that are hidden in prisons and caves and dungeons. There's just no one there to speak for them and just say, let them go. Mm-hmm. And that still hits me to this day.
Yeah.
And the guys that I was serving we were still captive in a way to our old patterns. So I just got deeper, and then in 2017 we latched on to our current property. So we served about 10 guys in that model, and today we have places for 190 guys.
Wow, good
today.
for you. That's pretty exciting stuff. So that's Freedom Works, and it's freedomworks.com, right? myfreedomworks.com.
myfreedomworks.com. Yeah.
For more information. George, I'm looking forward to having you back because we got to pick up where we left off, but so glad you dropped by. Thanks for sharing your story.